Good evening. Buenas noches. Welcome, everybody, at our special event with Chris Thomas, co-founder and partner at Assembly Ventures, who will explain us why he believes that Mobility 4.0 and ISA framework represents the biggest opportunity of his lifetime. My name is Terry Anderson, CEO and co-founder of Impulse for Women and director of investor relations of the venture capital fund called Telegraph Hill. And I would like you to welcome and thank you for your participation. I will have the pleasure to introduce Chris Thomas, one of the most prestigious experts on mobility and venture capital, tonight at CASA SEAT.
Thank you.
In this very special week for Barcelona, as we are hosting the Mobile World Congress. Who is Chris, in fact? Chris Thomas, co-founder and partner at Assembly Ventures, Detroit, Berlin, and Silicon Valley, where he sits in the board of our Next Energy. Prior to Assembly Ventures, he co-founded the Detroit Mobility Lab and the Michigan Mobility Institute, and acted as a senior advisor to mobility startups around the globe. Previous to this, Chris co-founded Fontanalis Partners, and for over a decade, worked to build it into one of the premier investment firms in next-generation mobility. While at Fontanalis, he served as a board member for Nutonomy, acquired by Aptiv in October 2017, and Caramba Security, and as a board observer at ParkMe, acquired by Inrex in September 2015, Park Mobile, acquired by BMW in January 2018, Life 360 IPO in May 2019, Oster SPAC in December 2020, and Smart Cargo.
This bio is too long.
Chris, welcome and good evening, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Before giving you the floor, let me explain to the audience how we are going to handle this session. First, I will invite Chris to make a short presentation to share his views on investing in startups that move the world. He will present where and why to invest in startups throughout the mobility sector and his perspective on the most innovative startups that will move the Western world over the next decade. After his short and inspiring speech, I will initiate a debate and also ask some experts who are tonight with us to react and ask him questions. Finally, I will open the floor to any of you who want to make some additional questions or comments. So say this, dear Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I'm going to stand, because I like to pace. And we have a lot to cover. We only have 20 minutes to kind of go through my pieces. And I usually like Q&A, so come up with questions as you go through. I'd much rather engage as we go, but I'll start this way. So we're talking about, or the title of this event tonight was investing in the space, but how are we investing, and where are we investing, and why is mobility so excited? So what we've done, and you talked about the ISA framework, ISA, we've stepped back and talked about and built a new framework for looking at mobility holistically around the world, how best to invest, and how best to enable the companies that are a part of moving the world. I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight. So what is mobility? There's a lot of definitions that I'm sure all of you have heard. Many focus uniquely on automotive. Automotive is certainly a part of mobility, but it's so much more. There's lots of discussions now on micromobility. There's lots of people focused on how do we colonize the moon. All of these things are mobility. So we define it broadly by definition to ensure that we're taking advantage of the opportunity that is this space, the physical and digital movement of people, goods, data, and energy. Now, these are big, big markets, and it's about what are the companies that are at the intersection of these markets, how are they going to move across all different spatial realms, and how are they going to maximize value? So what's the landscape? And this is a slide that we spent a lot of time with my partners and I talking about. Felix Schäufelen, who's here in the crowd from Berlin, and our partner Jessica Robinson in Detroit, as well as others that put this piece together. And we started with the macro trends. You know, individualization, looking at the bespoke ways in which we're going to be either moving as individuals, having goods delivered to us, and that entire supply chain. is going to be an incredibly important part of how we think about opportunities in the future of mobility. Urbanization as a key trend. You look at Barcelona, which is a beautiful city, and it's really a pleasure to be here. My good friend Fernando's in the crowd as well, who's kind of given me a very short tour. Last time I was here, I'm getting a much longer one this time. But the opportunities and the challenges of urbanization as to how do you maximize, how do you look at curb space in a way in which provides great service but also doesn't clog up the system, if you will. And then sustainability. And we're going to talk about what sustainability means. Traditionally, sustainability has been something that's been very focused just on how do we get to alternative technologies or energy as quickly as possible. I'm going to challenge you guys to think about it a little differently. Actors, we know all the actors, the startups, the investors, the corporates, the governments, academia. It's really important to understand, though, that partnerships between these major actors is what's going to maximize value. No one of them will have a monopoly on how the world moves. The vectors of change, shifting modes, looking at new ways that we're going to operate across differentiated spatial environments, optimizing efforts, and then unlocking data, going from predictive or descriptive to predictive, moving toward AI and machine learning. Understanding what the major influences are. L, I love L, labor. Those are going to be incredibly important with regard to where the regulatory environment and the ecological environment's going. And then last but not least, what are the value drivers? And we're going to talk a lot about, as it relates to sustainability, what is value and what are we doing and why. So one example that I just want to quickly bring up, ENBW, this is a company that was a regional German utility that through really unique partnerships with the private sector built the most prolific charging network in all of Europe, I would offer. This is one that they stepped back and said, what don't we have? How do we provide for a future that doesn't yet exist yet in the future of electrification? And they were incredibly savvy in anticipating the future based on great partners who were helping them do that. This is one example, and it's one that comes from the public sector that you don't usually see, but it's important to understand that it's partnerships that will drive growth. So you talked about ISA, and ISA is really important. Most of you in this crowd, if you're here, you're probably familiar with something called CASE, Connected Autonomous Shared Electric. We believe this framework that was come up with about 10 years ago by a savvy consultant and a savvy German auto player is the wrong framework. It's one that is not focused uniquely on how do we actually bring technology platforms to maximize value. So what we've put together is something, ISA stands for Infrastructure, Systems, and Applications. Infrastructure as the bedrock of mobility, the physical and digital, and the way in which we're going to be looking at infrastructure as a core technology attribute, but also something that's a secondary supplier of technology for autonomous vehicles and other assets in different geospatials. The systems layer that connects the physical and the digital. How are we looking at the atoms and the bytes in maximizing value there? And last but not least, the applications layer that looks at the way in which you touch the customer and you monetize the customer in all aspects of movement. So infrastructure, many of these things you guys are aware of, and I'm being cognizant of the feedback, so I'm not wanting to move too much. When we think about multimodal infrastructure, the need to reflect and be responsible to different mobility modes, we know about urbanization, we know about the way in which the mobility mix is changing, but I'd ask you to think a lot about that as it relates to roadways, curb space, different modes for terrestrial transportation, for ground transportation, if you will, and then different ways we're going to be utilizing, rail, maritime, air, and otherwise. All of these are going to be a big part of that future digital infrastructure that's going to make everything more optimized. To the systems layer, really focusing on the way in which we can have better operations, and this may be hard to see, but this really starts with understanding the objectives, orchestration around the future of digital and physical assets and the way they're coming together for the future of movement. To aggregation, taking all of that data and using it efficiently across very different legacy assets that are already deployed. And last but not least, coordination, understanding the way in which we can utilize data incredibly more efficiently as it relates to the way the world moves. And then applications. The future of mobility is demarcated by interconnected ecosystems, and so this is incredibly important. Applications are certainly apps in the ways in which you're engaging with differentiated TNCs, the Ubers, the Lyfts, the Cabifys of the world. You're engaging with different delivery services, but it's so much more in terms of the back office when you think about the future of the warehouse, the future of delivery, the future of manufacturing. All of these things are going to be incredibly important as it relates to the customer and the user of these systems as they're going forward. So ISA as a core framework is what we're investing in as a firm. And when you think about where you're investing and how you're investing, there's two things I want to leave you with, and I hopefully will dive a little bit into this in the Q&A. I was asked earlier, I was interviewed by one of the affiliate organizations, and they asked me the question, what are the 3 words that define the future of sustainability, sustainable mobility, if you will? And I talked about high integrity bridging. This is a bit of an odd phrase. It's not one that I expected to say. And I think when we think about what is the future of movement, and when we are talking about where do we want to invest and who do we want to invest in, we have to look at the future of energy as it relates to bridging from what we have today to the differentiated solutions we're going to have tomorrow. But it can't be one or the other. We have to use both. And we have to make sure that we're taking advantage of all the resources we have now to maximize a clean future. And I think sometimes as a purist, we want one or the other, and it won't help us from a national security perspective. It certainly won't help us from a resource utilization perspective. And then 2, I think we need to be focused on who are we building bridges with and to. We at Assembly are a unique entity in that we are focused on, we're based on 2 main hypotheses. One, we believe strongly that we're in the midst of a bifurcation with China, that is the West, as it relates to manufacturing, logistics, and supply chain, and the differentiated opportunities by technology enablement that will come as we see offshoring from China to other locations in APAC and back to our continents in North America, in the Americas, and in Europe. And then 2, we believe very strongly in the legacy industrial centers of the Western world. And this is something you never hear from guys up here who are talking about venture capital, I'm sure. We believe strongly that the Barcelonas, the Detroits, the Stuttgarts, the Tokyos, there is a tremendous opportunity for those legacy geographic places and the companies that are within them to drive the future of mobility if they strike the right partnerships, if they're looking at the things they are not so as to be better at what they do, and if they're expansive around what mobility is. And we've seen incredible examples around the globe of automotive companies, and I think Volkswagen and Seat are very much one of them, that are leaning into the future of electrification and propulsion, the future of technology enablement, and really looking at not just one core asset of mobility, but what is that broad selection that they can offer to their consumers. So that's the premise of what we believe and why we believe it. I think during Q&A, we're going to talk more about the entrepreneurs that we've had the chance to work with, what we look for in those entrepreneurs. But I'd ask you guys all to think a little bit differently about what mobility is. It's not just Uber or Cabify. It's not just GM or Stellantis. This is about how the world moves. And all of us in this room, through the partnerships we strike and where we spend time and who we spend it with, will define that world. And so I believe strongly that this is the biggest opportunity of my lifetime as an individual sector, mobility holistically. And it's not just the value creation. It's the ability to actually be a part of improving the way the world moves and where we and our children and our grandchildren go and how they're served through the technologies we invest in today. Thank you.
Well, before giving you the floor, I will ask you some questions. What as a VC that you are the main investment, from a VC perspective, what are the main investment differences between the US and Europe?
We were talking about this before.
And Asia.
Oh, it's fascinating. Well, that's a whole nother angle. I think with the US and Europe, it's always fascinating to me and to my team when we look at valuations between geographies. And you could have a very similar entrepreneurial team by way of background, you could have a similar technology, but there is a big arbitrage opportunity by way of pre-money valuations, early stage valuations on companies in European startups and US startups, for example. Mm-hmm. I think maybe Asia falls somewhere in between. And at later rounds, all of these get inflated for good or bad reasons. But there really is an opportunity, and this is one of the reasons why we're excited about Assembly, is that we have the chance to understand what's happening in different major industrial centers and entrepreneurial centers around the Western world. How can we actually ensure that they not only are brought to major customers or partners or acquirers, but are done so in a way in which we know that this company sitting in Barcelona, and this company sitting in Los Angeles, we can do that apples to apples and see that this company is better. And we can uniquely open up those markets. But that's one way between the US, between North America and Europe that's very different. I also think that the capital formation, when it comes to European funds and North American funds, there's just deeper pools of capital in the Americas by way of foundations and other ways in which those pieces come together. So that's always interesting in terms of where the investment's coming from and how you're building those syndicates. But I think there's more that we're alike than different in many respects. And I think we were talking before the panel. Mm-hmm. When I think about who I want to invest with high-integrity individuals who believe strongly in the place they're from, but also believe strongly in the ideals that they represent and that they're living as a part of everything that we want, this world to be. That's something that's very unique when I engage with investors or VCs in London or in Berlin or in Paris. And there's always bad apples in the bunch. But for the most part, it's wonderful people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you think that the mobility sector has become aware of the impact it has in society? And if yes, how it has evolved in government, investors, and society terms in the last years?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you'll never have a case in living memory for us that you have a company like Uber that will just roll over governments. You'll never have that happen again, which is good. I think you want to have partnerships that actually empower and benefit all parts of that transaction and those systems. But I think the awareness is very, very real. I think the question is, how do we execute on that does well by the entrepreneurs and the companies that are being stood up, the needs of the consumer and the citizen, and then meets the regulatory goals, but that hopefully are structured based on those first two. Mm-hmm. And there's not punitive regulatory environments just for the sake of. I mean, I think one other big difference between the US and Europe is that you have one huge landmass in North America with the same laws, the same language, the same regulatory environment, notwithstanding states. It's a huge advantage there. Mm-hmm. So I think that's something that's very interesting by way of where we think that's going to go.
But by the other side, the European citizens are not moving from their own city.
It's true.
As you know, I am CEO of Impulse for Women. Therefore, can you mention 3 startups led by women in the mobility sector in which you will invest and why?
So better than naming a startup, I'll name 3 incredible women in mobility. And I think that it's interesting, like Felix and I have the benefit of having Jessica Robinson, and I'll start with Jessica, as our founder, as one of our co-founders at Assembly. Mm-hmm. You have someone who is a pure operator who did amazing things in terms of one of the premier managers of fleets in North America, mm-hmm. who's incredibly savvy, but who has not had the opportunity to invest at a direct basis. But it's all of her experience that brings her the ability to have unique insights that others don't have. And so I think you have someone that's incredibly high integrity, knows her craft, soup to nuts, and understands everything about what she's building. Anna Jaffe is a CEO of a company called Mobi Systems out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. They focus on utilizing AI and machine learning to optimize movement. And this could be everything from a travel where you're going into a city and you want to optimize the experience that you like, and you know what are the things you'd like to see and like to do. It can be a worker who's going on a sales call into a definitive place so as to maximize the touch points they'll have with potential customers. Mm-hmm. It can be amusement parks, and how do you actually maximize the opportunity and the experience for the consumer, but also for the owner. So they've built something really interesting. She's an MIT grad, just a remarkable woman. I had the chance to work with her as an advisor in a previous life, and she's remarkable. And then last but not least, there's also in Boston, strangely enough, Rana El-Kaloubi, who has a company called Activa, and they do AI in the vehicle. So being able to look at you driving a vehicle or being in a vehicle, and through your movements and what you're doing, ensure that things are much safer than they otherwise would be. Understanding if you're nodding off, understanding if you are looking in some way and the ADAS system knows that something else is about to happen outside of your peripheral view. They were recently acquired by Smart Eye, and she's a prolific writer and someone who I think is just embodies the right traits in the mobility ecosystem. But there's so many. Mm-hmm. Like in Detroit, it's exciting right now. We have remarkable groups of men and women, but one group that's focused uniquely on women in mobility just released a new book. And it's been incredibly well received by way of these really great stories of women who have persevered and built companies that will or have moved the world already. But those would be 3 that come to mind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I will start, if you allow me, to ask some experts who are tonight with us and address your specific question to continue the dialogue. If there's any questions?
How can you, my name is Andrew Funk, entrepreneur. First of all, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to explain everything. Oh, okay, microphone. My name is Andrew Funk from Homeless Entrepreneur. And mobility for us is the difference between people staying in poverty and becoming active working citizens. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to listen to all the amazing work you're doing in investment. And my question is how you think you can include those excluded from mobility into the design of PPPs and investment opportunities to create greater mobility for all.
That's a great question. And so I think, just fun personal fact, my father worked in prosthetics for his entire career. So he made artificial limbs and artificial braces, if you will. So I had the experience as a young man to engage with lots of folks who were physically disabled. I'm also a U.S. Army veteran, so I've had the chance to work with men and women who have come back from experiences that have left them, in different cases, emotionally disabled, mentally disabled, and by no means incapable, but just with baggage and things that they're working through. And so one of the things I love about this job, and I love about what we've built at Assembly, is we've got an amazing group across our entire team of people who understand and come from a working class perspective, who are eager to build systems that include all comers and ensure that we're not building things that are just bespoke solutions, if you will. So our announced investment, Our Next Energy that we spoke to, this is a business looking at kind of the future of battery. And one of the main reasons we were excited about this business, notwithstanding the amazing syndicate or the amazing founder, was that they're doing two things really uniquely. They're doing a hybrid battery architecture that allows you to have two differentiated chemistries on the same battery. You can have one that's kind of your low-density daily driver, 98% of your rides. You can have one when you do go long distances that's a higher density, more expensive one, on average just as same price or cheaper, but can also go much longer distance. But the other thing it does is it's looking at the chemistry of those batteries to ensure that it's ethical. And what I mean by that is if you look at one of the major battery chemistry compositions, without getting too deep in the weeds, there's an asset called cobalt that's highly used and proliferated. A minority of cobalt globally is mined by children in the Congo. How can we ensure that we do not have a major component of battery systems from your cell phone to your vehicle that doesn't have that as a part of its supply chain? And so I love your question because I think that we think about this sometimes in terms of access for individuals who are handicapped or disabled, those that are in lower socioeconomic strata who are trying to lift themselves up. I also would offer that I think it's great to see public and private sector working together to ensure that we're bringing everybody along in a very real way. But I also think we need to think deeper about our supply chains and about where we're sourcing materials and where those things are being made. And so when I look at the world today, and I talked a little bit about that thesis around bifurcation, we need to ensure that not only are we utilizing materials in the West that we control, that are within our purview and within our countries, but we also need to make sure that we're partnering with individuals who are ethical and who are treating people at every touch point of the way we're building these systems in a way that's kind and reasonable and what we would expect from those systems. But this is something my partners and I talk about a lot, and I think there's businesses that are focused just on ensuring that something is as efficient as possible. We always step back and say, well, how are you doing that? And your question is fantastic, so I appreciate it.
Thank you. Please.
Hello, my name is Pablo, and I work in the Innovation, Customer Experience and Sustainability unit of AENA. AENA is the airport manager here in Spain. We manage different airports in Spain and also in different countries. And I would like to ask you about a topic which we are working a lot now and analyzing a lot, which is the urban air mobility. It's a hot topic nowadays, and I would like to ask you, how do you see this market is going to evolve in the short, medium, long term, mainly here in Europe, because we have seen that in other countries, mainly in Asia, is something that is becoming a reality. And I would like to know, what do you think about that? And in the short, medium, long term, is going to be a new way of transport in our cities.
And the focus is urban mobility, yes?
Urban air mobility.
Urban air mobility?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic, sorry. I'm glad I clarified that. I would have went down a different direction. So I believe strongly, so I have two little boys in Detroit, and they're good Detroiters, and they'll have driver's license, and they'll drive me crazy, I'm sure. But my granddaughter and my grandson, when they come, they won't. And it's not that they won't be moving, but they won't be doing it themselves. So I believe strongly, within my lifetime, urban air mobility as a component part of personal human transport will be a component part of it. In the short term, I think what we're going to see is we've seen some leading cities globally who have leaned in with, whether it be differentiated air mobility port assets that they're launching from. Singapore has done a tremendous job not only of getting attention, but also diving in to really have that be a component part. You also look at places like Dubai. I had the pleasure of speaking at the Hypermotion conference during the World Expo late last year, and they are leaning in a big way for a commercial deployment of urban air mobility as a core part of their transportation system. But you're seeing this move more slowly in Western markets, mostly because of regulatory issues and or a lack of understanding. So I think that's going to be a little bit of stop and start. And we'll have at the beginning, and I would say to your point around short, medium, and long, the short term will be a lot of pilots that aren't really functional or for the masses. They're going to be pilot projects that showcase a technology and you have the ability to move forward. The other thing I think that's super important is that most people think of urban air mobility in the context of personal transport, you and I jumping in one and going from A to B. I actually think that the driver will be driven by logistics. I think we're going to see very definitive use cases where, whether it be robotic assets, air, land, or sea, are going to be much more valuable, much more easy to deploy, and we're going to see those first. And that could be within open ecosystems from Barcelona to Madrid. That can be in warehouse environments, a variety of ways in which that will be utilized. And the reason that'll deploy there first is, one, there'll be a business case immediately, and two, there's not going to have the regulatory oversight to have them deployed in those areas. I do think, though, medium and long term, we're going to see definitive route planning, especially for, like, in the North American market, the FAA, for example. There's a large concern, and rightly so, of do I want dronal assets dropping off packages in my city? And for me, the answer is no. My boys play in our front yard. That scares me. And so I think that in the short term, that's going to be a real issue. But in the long term, I think we're going to have aerial drops that will go to definitive drop points where you'll have warehouse assets that then deploy and distribute in different ways. I think for human transport, whether it's something that I still think we're going to have a hub and spoke model for the most part. I don't think all of us, owning our personal aerial vehicle is something I will see in my lifetime. But I do think the ports that I'll be able to drive to will be right downtown, in the city of Detroit, for my example, that can take me anywhere within 20 minutes that would have been an hour and a half otherwise. But some of the biggest issues from a driver perspective is we need higher energy density and batteries that are going to be utilized in these assets because they all will be electric. And right now, from a payload perspective, there's a disconnect as it relates to how we're going to do this in a sustainable, repeatable, revenue-generating way that also provides a very safe experience, whether it be for, supply chain materials or for, more importantly, our loved ones.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question?
Thank you. I am the president of the automotive cluster in Catalonia. One of the questions that I received coming from the members of this association is that the mobility in the future, what it means. Mobility, it means growth in selling cars, or is a reduction of cars. I think it is difficult. I have difficulty to answer these questions because asking these questions to the OEMs, I think always for them it means a growth, of course. Of course. Maybe in a different shape, maybe an electrical instead of combustion engines. But it is difficult to answer. I think that what is your answer about this?
That's the $64,000 question right there. It's the right question. And so I think for us, like for me, what is mobility? And people always ask me, what's most important to you? And I want to walk as much as I can, and I want to get home and have dinner with my family. And so what do we value when we're moving, and why do we value it? All of us value time. We want more time. That's the most valuable thing we have. And so this question of how do we have growth, how do we provide new assets that will continue to have a product set or an option set that allows for more monetization. And we've seen this with global automotive right now, with base prices, MSRP coming out, just going through the roof, and as well as in the used car market based on scarcity. But for me, I think when it comes down to is something that for many years I've called, everybody in this room has a individual mobility utility. So if you all go back to Economics 101, you'll remember the concept of utility, and you want to maximize an experience for you personally. It's different for us. It may be that I want to get in a black car, put my nose in my phone, and work for an hour. It may be that it's a beautiful day and I want to go for a walk or a bike, or I love to drive, and I want to jump in that vehicle and I want to go. It's going to be different for everybody. So I think the way that you're going to maximize that experience is really going to be a very bespoke and valuable data overlay that's going to allow me to understand what it is that you want and when do you want it, that's going to provide you a maximum utility with any one of those experiences, and is going to do so in a model that allows you not necessarily to own a vehicle, but to own a ticket to a system. So the brands of today, the global automotive brands, they're very valuable, and there's ones that have different connotations for different reasons. I believe strongly that within my lifetime, I'll be a part of an XYZ system where I can have a vehicle brought to me and I can use it for 2 weeks. I can go camping with my family and have a larger vehicle. I can be in an urban environment and have a smaller vehicle. I personally don't own a vehicle. I do everything I can to be as involved in new mobility systems as possible. And so that's going to drive this in a big way, and that's what the OEMs are trying to figure out. And so what we found, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are some OEMs who I think are leaning in a very honest way, without ego. And they're saying, I'm good at this. I don't know what this is. And this over here I've never even heard of. How do I actually put together partnerships from a technology perspective, from a systems perspective, from an OEM manufacturing perspective that will maximize value, but more importantly, will provide me a service that will be very, very sticky with my consumers. And I think we miss that last part sometimes. And I think we're still, I love a sexy automobile. I love a vehicle. I love a convertible. I love being able to drive. But some people don't. And I think cracking that nut is where the value is. And that's why we get excited investing in air, land, sea, and space, investing in core technologies that are going to drive components of it, but stepping back and saying, how do you move the world in an ethical and a sustainable and a fun way? That's where value is, and that's what we like. That's what we work on. It's a great question.
Thank you.
You mentioned earlier the strategic challenges between Asia, particularly China, that you mentioned. And my question is, what do you foresee for a clean hydrogen future? Should we be focusing more on that than we are now? Because clearly lithium, cobalt, these are finite resources, whereas clean hydrogen is not. Perhaps Japan is trying to push that and is not having much success because of the cost. What are your thoughts?
May I ask where you're from or who you're with?
Yes, so I run a startup called Dinubi. I'm the co-founder, actually, at MIT alum as well.
Excellent. So I think hydrogen has a really important role to play. And as you know, there's a lot of differentiating opinions on this. Some say hydrogen, we should stop completely. There's no reason to go down that road. Infrastructure build out, differentiated kind of, manufacturing, chemistries, components, builds, what have you. But I think it's going to be for specific use cases. So Hyundai has done a really good job, I think, of leaning into the future of hydrogen, and this is a core plank of how they're looking at their propellant technology strategy. But they're starting on kind of points to points with understanding the logistics opportunity, and I think that's incredibly savvy. Electrification is something that we're seeing people, the consumer wants it, and it's also a regulatory driver. It's being driven through the ways in which that's moving forward. But we're going to continue to see efficiencies in the ICE engine and a supply chain that's already established where you better believe, every dollar will be used out of those sunk costs to build out that infrastructure. So hydrogen, I think, comes. I don't think it comes quickly. I think it's something that is very focused on bespoke use cases. I think the same about autonomy. I think we're going to look at autonomous systems are being deployed, and I had the pleasure, you mentioned autonomy, of sitting on the board of one of the largest cash exits in the history of full-stack autonomous software. But it's not deployed widely right now. I think we'll start to see it in bespoke ecosystems. We'll start to see it in bespoke geospatials where the training data is very keen and they know how to do it. I look at, and that will deploy rather very broadly and very quickly once it reaches that grade. Hydrogen, I think, will be a part of the toolkit. I also, to your point, believe it'll be something that's a bit of a redundant system that people will be glad they have when some of these other things either aren't available or there's a desire not to use them for good reason.
Hi, my name is Melike Altun. I would like to ask before, there was a question and you said that what we value is actually time. I would like to ask, what about safety? So what do you think about the safety issue? How is it going to be in the future by the mobility sector?
No, it's interesting you ask, and so I think time is only as valuable as we have the ability to use it. So safety is paramount. But safety's been tough to deploy and monetize within automotive broadly, but also mobility. And so what we're starting to see is some really interesting opportunities within the infrastructure layer as it relates to data streams, AI and otherwise, that can be redundant systems to automobiles, autonomous or otherwise, to ensure that those intersections are safer. So that's one example, I think, where you're going to start to see these really interesting data layers that allow for much more safety, both external to the vehicle and on the vehicle itself from an ADAS perspective. Most autonomy today, it's not level 4. You're looking at level 3, level 2. You're looking at traditional ADAS and some aspects of advanced detection and safety systems that allow you to ensure that you're focused on safety. But for me, safety is paramount, and it's not just in the movement of goods and people, data and energy. It's in how they're moved, it's in how they're generated, and it's in how they're, where they're going and why. And so we are always looking for businesses that have a safety angle. I can tell you it's hard to find in terms of companies that are just focused on providing something that immediately has a safety component, but also a revenue stream that we can allow it to grow and then proliferate in a big way. But we're looking for them. And so it's something we think a lot about. If you know of any businesses, please talk to me afterwards. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Any other question?
These are great questions, guys. Thank you.
I think I would like to finish
Uh-oh.
with one question. What kind of changes need to be activated both in the offer side and the demand side to make mobility 4.0 a mainstream phenomenon?
So I believe it is a mainstream phenomenon. We're already there. We've gone from unpowered assets and walking to the steam revolution, to the automotive revolution, to where we are today, which I would offer is kind of the digital revolution. But on the supply and demand side, I think what we need more than anything are just unbelievable men and women who are building great businesses. And so people sometimes ask me, what is your job? And it's always fascinating, like in terms of trying to explain, what you do. But I came up working blue-collar jobs, working horrible jobs. I came up doing all different types of things as a banker and as a soldier and things along those lines. But what I really do right now is I just find and I have the chance to work with amazing people. So on the supply side, we need more entrepreneurs who are putting their talents towards something that I think will be highly accretive by way of value creation, that will have a huge impact in how we move around the world. How do we ensure everything from time to safety to the pleasure we derive in an experience that is going from point A to point B or in something being brought to us? So that's a big piece. On the demand side, this goes back to what I said before around the importance of approaching this from a bridging perspective. There's some people who would say we need to immediately move to all aspects of sustainable energy. We need to shut off every nuclear plant. We need to shut down every hydro producer. We need to get rid of oil and gas today. It's wrong. I think it's wrong. And it's not because I think that those are necessarily the best use of capital or the best creation of energy, but it's because we have to bridge to a future that doesn't use those assets, or we don't need those assets. But trying to do so all at once exposes us to things that we can't expose ourselves to as a society. So the regulatory environment, from a demand perspective, I think, needs to be one that is focused on migration toward a better tomorrow and creating the technologies and the energy solutions that are going to be sustainable, but also serving the needs of everyone today, from those of us who can jump in an Uber without thinking about it, to folks who can't, who are on public transit every day, and who are going to be utilizing that system for the rest of their lives. And so those are the things that come to mind out of the gate. And I think we're doing a good job on both. I hope we are. And we can do better tomorrow.
Yep. Well, thanks to all of the attendants for coming, the Flow Zero participants and Chris. You don't have any other questions? So Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear Chris, dear experts, thank you very much for participating tonight. It was indeed a very rich dialogue, talking about safety, time, mobility, risk, and I hope you have enjoyed it as I did. Please feel free, if you do not know CASA SEAT, to visit the ground floors upstairs, and the first one where you will see in addition the Cupra SEAT new version. Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. Thank you, Chris.